Thank you everyone for joining the ACES webinar series. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Debbie Silvester from Curtin University. She's an ARC Future Fellow at the Department of Chemistry. Her research is well known to many of us. Her research includes understanding electrochemical processes with a particular focus on sensing. And she's particularly interested in using ionic liquids, which many of us know are fabulous, interesting new solvents. She looks at them for a number of different electrochemical reactions. Ionic liquids, of course, have a lot of advantageous properties such as low vapor pressure, conductivity, wide electrochemical window, high chemical and thermal stability, high polarity, and also importantly, the ability to dissolve a wide range of compounds. So she will tell us all about her research into using and understanding ionic liquids. We would encourage questions at the end of her presentation. If you want to ask questions in the chat, we'll read them out at the end, but we will not interrupt Debbie as she's presenting, and she'll not be following the chat, so I'll chair the questions at the end of the presentation, but we do encourage your questions. Okay, before we start, please make sure that you have muted your mic so that we don't interrupt Debbie when she's talking. And right, over to you, Debbie. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for this kind invitation to talk to the ARC ACES seminar series. As you said, I believe that we've got lots of research overlap, and hopefully a lot of people will find some of the stuff that I'm talking about quite interesting. So I'm going to talk about the application of ionic liquids as solvents in electrochemical sensors. And so the type of sensors which we are interested in are called amperometric sensors. So this is where we apply a potential and we monitor the current as a function of time. And amperometric gas sensors in particular are very widely used to detect gases for a number of different applications, such as monitoring air pollution, for occupational health and safety, for monitoring toxic gases, and for going inside enclosed spaces. You can also use them for monitoring human health. So you can detect gases in the exhaled breath of patients, and they can be used to detect explosive gases before there's any incident. And you can see here in figure B how a typical amperometric gas sensor is designed, and these are available commercially. So you have a handheld device which contains a couple of batteries, and then inside this device you have the sensor, and the user just simply presses the button on the device, and then a potential is biased and you get a readout of the concentration of that particular gas in the environment. And so the sensors themselves look like this in figure C. You can see they have a plastic casing, they're covered by a gas permeable membrane, and at the bottom you have 3 pins which connect to the electrodes inside. So in figure D you can see the inside schematic of an amperometric gas sensor, and the red parts show the 3 electrodes: the sensing or the working electrode, the reference, and the counter electrode. And these are connected through the pins to the handheld device. The electrodes have an electrolyte that connects them together, and this electrolyte is typically a water sulfuric acid mixture. So the gas, the analyte gas, will go through a membrane at the top and then reach the sensing electrode, where you can oxidize or reduce this gas and produce a current. So these kind of sensors are based on a 1950s design, and they're very widely used in industry, but they have a couple of drawbacks in that they typically use a fairly high amount of expensive platinum electrode material, so they're very hard to miniaturize, and they also have this liquid electrolyte, which is normally a volatile solvent. So in hot and dry conditions, in particular, the solvent can dry up and then the sensor no longer works. So my group and I have been interested over the last few years in using these very cheap, commercially available planar electrode devices, such as shown in figure E. So this is a thin film electrode. This one actually has a gold working electrode and a platinum counter and reference electrodes. And you can see how small the device is on the end of a fingertip. And there's a very thin layer of metal, only about 150 nanometers thick, which means that these sensors are very cheap. They don't use very much of the inert platinum or gold metal, and they're only a few dollars per device. And so the main difference is the way that we use these is we drop a small volume of a non-volatile ionic liquid onto the top. And so we have the situation in figure F, where the gas goes in, partitions in from the gas phase into the ionic liquid. Once you have an equilibration, then the gas diffuses to the electrode where it's oxidized or reduced. And this is different to the commercial sensors in that normally the gas goes through the permeable membrane and reaches the electrode before going into the solvent. And so I've recently been in contact with some commercial gas sensor companies, and it's very interesting talking to the people who manufacture these devices. So there's a very good chapter from a book by Joseph Stetter, who says that there are the 5 S's which are important to characterize chemical sensors. So the first is the sensitivity, and then the selectivity, and the speed of response, which is the response time, typically 90% of the current response. The stability, so the temporal, the physical, and the chemical stability. And then at the bottom, the shape, the size, and the cost. And so this is important depending on the application you're looking at. You need to have a sensor that will fit in certain dimensions, and also that is cost effective to the end user. So the gas sensor companies look at all of these parameters, and they get all of their information from measuring the sensor signal under various conditions and at different times. And so they have electrodes and electrolytes, and then they have their gas of interest that they introduce at different concentrations. So the first way that they evaluate the sensor is by looking at the sensor signal or the current as a function of time when you add in different concentrations of gas. And you can then see the calibration graph on the right-hand side. And once you have a linear calibration graph, then this sensor can be further tested for its short-term stability. So this is where you apply a potential for a longer time, and ideally it will have a good short-term stability in that it will maintain a constant current over a short term. And then finally, once the sensor device has passed these tests, then it goes on for further tests to look at the effect of changing the temperature, the pressure, and the relative humidities. So the gas sensor manufacturers do a lot of testing of their devices. So obviously we're trying to now change the design of these sensors and use different materials. And we're very interested in ionic liquids because of all the application that Jenny mentioned earlier, and particularly they're non-volatile, so we can use just a tiny volume, so a microliter droplet or less of the ionic liquid. So we have our planar device, and then we drop 1 or 0.5 microliters of ionic liquid over the 3 electrodes. So we have our gas continuously flowing, and we have a partitioning step where the gas goes into the liquid phase. And then once we have equilibration, we apply a potential to oxidize or reduce that gas. But there are some challenges that come with changing the design of the sensor. So now we have what's called a membrane-free gas sensor. And so the challenges associated with this include leakage of the electrolyte. So we've got a droplet of a liquid, and we can overcome this by using gelled materials, and I'll tell you about that today. Anybody that's used ionic liquids before will also know that they take in water. So we really ideally need to look at hydrophobic materials because we need to have these gas sensors able to work in a wide range of humidities. We'd like a fast response time. A drawback of ionic liquids is their fairly high viscosity, which slows the diffusion coefficients. And particularly if we gel the materials, then we have very highly viscous solutions. So we are looking at improving response times by going to very thin layers of electrolyte. For any sensor, we would like to have a good selectivity in mixed gas environments so we can determine the gas of interest is present. We'd also like a low-cost design, so the electrodes themselves are very cheap, and ionic liquids, although they're not cheap, we're using a very small volume of them. Miniaturization is also good, but miniaturizing the electrode itself can also give rise to very small currents. So we have to find ways to improve the analyte signal. And then I've put this as a challenge on the bottom, that ionic liquids are highly tunable. I think that makes them very interesting, but it can be a challenge. For example, if you're trying to design a sensor with ionic liquids, there are a whole range of different electrolytes possible. And it's not as simple as saying this one will work for this and this one will work for this gas. And so the sensor manufacturers typically just look at their responses, and they often don't think about the fundamentals about what's really happening at the electrode surface. And this picture here I took out of a paper which is actually about supercapacitors, but it's a really nice image that shows the difference between conventional solvent electrolyte systems and ionic liquids. So when you apply a potential, such as a negative anodic potential here, you can see in the conventional solvent electrolyte system, you have the solvent molecules that surround your supporting electrolyte. Whereas in ionic liquids, because the cations and the anions are both the solvent and the electrolyte, you have local ordering of ionic liquids at the electrodes. And there's been a lot of work about this done, especially by Cornishev, to look at the electrical double layer in ionic liquids. And people like Rob Atkin at UWA has looked in detail at how the layers build up at the electrode surface. But generally, it's believed that if you have a negatively charged electrode, you have positively charged cations on the surface, and then you have alternating layers of anions, cations, anions. And so the behavior, this different structure at the electrode will also affect the sensor response. So this is important to understand because we know that the bulk parameters, such as the gas solubility or the diffusion coefficients, will affect the response. But we also are understanding that the electrical double layer also has a big effect. So in the aqueous-based gas sensors, the reaction mechanisms at the working and the counter electrodes are quite well known. But in ionic liquids, because we have an aprotic media, the mechanisms are often very different to water solvents. So we can detect any redox active gas that can be oxidized or reduced in ionic liquids. And we have looked at a range of gases, including oxygen, hydrogen, and various different toxic gases, including sulfur dioxide and ammonia, etc. And generally, these polar gases are quite highly soluble in ionic liquids. And this is beneficial for measuring low concentrations. And the non-polar gases, such as oxygen, are only moderately soluble. And it's really important for us to understand not only how the electrical double layer works, but also what reaction mechanisms occur at the solid-liquid interface. And this is because often some electrogenerated products can passivate the electrode, and also there can be some reactions with the solvent, particularly the more unknown counter-electrode reaction. And so reaction mechanisms in ionic liquids have been studied fairly extensively, and I'm just going to mention 3 of them here. So oxygen gas reduces by 1 electron to superoxide, hydrogen gas oxidizes by 2 electrons to protons, and ammonia has an irreversible oxidation to form nitrogen and protons. So we need to understand these mechanisms in order to understand the sensor response. And when we're looking at designing better sensor materials, there's a couple of things that we can do. So we can modify the electrode surface. So for example, we can use a platinum surface and change the surface area. So my group and I have done some work on this. We've made porous platinum electrodes. We've also made 3-dimensional microarray electrodes and made dendritic structures. And these are all very useful to increase the surface area and improve our analyte response. Another thing you can do is to functionalize the surface to give selectivity towards specific analytes. You can do this by changing the electrode, for example, by electrode depositing different metals. And also recently we have had success for hydrogen detection by using a metal organic framework modified electrode. So I'm not actually going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the other thing that we can do, which is to change the electrolyte structure. So we're working with ionic liquids here. So the most simple thing we can do is to change the ions of the ionic liquid. And then another thing that we can do is to combine with polymers to create more robust sensors. And so I'll talk about both of these today in the talk. But you can see at the bottom, the thin film electrode has a gel polymer electrolyte coated on to the 3 electrodes. And this is a mixture of a imidazolium NTF2 ionic liquid with polymethyl methacrylate. So I'll talk about these today. We're also doing some work on polymerized ionic liquids at the moment, but this is still work in progress, so I haven't spoke about this in this presentation. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to focus on the reduction of oxygen. So this was originally to look at sensing oxygen in different humidity environments. So my PhD student Simon has done this work. So he has looked at how the oxygen reduction response changes when the humidity, the background humidity in the gas environment is changed. So you can see here cyclic voltammetry for oxygen reduction. And the black line is the 1 electron reversible reduction of oxygen to superoxide. You can see nice reversible voltammetry. And then as you increase the relative humidity level, so when we get to 13% humidity, you can see the green line shows already a slight increase in the current and also a separation in the peaks. And then as you go to 55% humidity, the current increase is more than double and the potential changes. And as you go to a very saturated environment, 95% humidity, we have an almost 4 times current and a very shifted potential for the reduction. So we have ferrocene in here as an internal redox couple, so you can see the shift in the potential. And what's happening here is that the mechanism in water follows either a 2 electron or a 4 electron reduction depending upon the pH. So as we're adding moisture to our gas stream, that's then dissolving into the ionic liquid, and we're changing over from our dry ionic liquid mechanism to a more water saturated environment. And we know that ionic liquids have many different structures, and they also take in different amounts of water. So we decided to look at the effect of changing the cation and the anion structure and how this affects the oxygen reduction reaction over a range of humidities. So we have a wide range of cations here. So the imidazoliums, and then particularly this tetraalkyl phosphonium with long chains, which is the most hydrophobic cation. And then we also change the anions. We have the more hydrophilic anions, the tetrafluoroborate and hexafluorophosphate. And then we move to our NTF2 and FAP hydrophobic ions. And so what Simon did was to measure the current response, or the normalized current response, as a function of increasing humidity. So the normalized current response here is the current response at a particular humidity divided by the current response in the dry environment. And we did this to reduce the effect of the different ionic liquid viscosities. And so what you can see here is when we keep the cation constant, so we have a C4 MIM cation, and we change the anion, you can see different responses as you go to higher humidity levels. So if you look at the highest humidity level, about 95%, you can see that some of the ionic liquids, particularly the BF4, has about 6 times the current response compared to the dry environment. And the order, the BF4, PF6, the NTF2 and the FAP, this follows well with the bulk solubility of water in the ionic liquids. But what's interesting here is if you look in the low humidity range, so 0 to 20%, there's not really much of an effect of the different ionic liquids. So it's mainly at the higher humidities where we see the anion effect. But it's very different when we look at the cation. So if we keep the anion constant with the NTF2, we have 8 different cations here. And you can see that even in the very low humidity range, the 0 to 20%, we have a very large response, a change in the current, even for 3 of the ionic liquids. So if you take the black line, this is the C2 MIM NTF2, and we already have a roughly 4 times current response at less than 20% humidity. And so it's really important to know this information, because if you're measuring oxygen reduction at different humidity levels, then this is going to have a very big effect on the current response. The best ionic liquid you can see on here is the P14666. So this is our large tetraalkyl phosphonium cation. And here it's only above about 80% where you start to see an increase in the current response. And overall, if you look, although the cation has a very large effect at the lower humidities, at the high humidities, generally the cation has almost negligible effect. And so together with my postdoc Jenny, Simon was looking or probing the structure of the ions at the electrode. And so, as I mentioned before, we have a negatively charged electrode. In the case of oxygen reduction, we bias negatively. So it's the cation that builds up on the electrode surface. And then we have our alternating layers of ions. And so we used atomic force microscopy to study these layers at the electrode and how they are affected by water. So when we're in a very dry environment, we can see the AFM tip as we approach it closer to the surface. We can see these distinct jumps in the force curve, which correspond to punching through the different layers of the ions. And we can measure the distance from the electrode, and we can show that the cation is on the electrode, and we have these alternating layers as expected. But when we have water present, we see in some of the ionic liquids, we see a very force curve which doesn't have any of these distinct jumps. And so this suggests that the layering of the ions at the electrode has been disrupted by the presence of water. And so we chose 3 extreme cases. So we chose the C2-MIM cation, which is the most hydrophilic, and the most hydrophobic, the P14666, and then something in between, which was the tetraalkyl ammonium. And we did an AFM study and showed that for in the presence of moisture, at 40% humidity, the ion layers were disrupted in the case of the first 2 cations, but at 40% humidity, we still see this nice ion structuring at the electrode in the tetraalkyl phosphonium. And so for the P14666, it's the reorientation of the alkyl chains forms a very dense hydrophobic layer that effectively blocks water from the electrode. And so this explains why we are seeing our more reversible 1 electron reduction in this ionic liquid, whereas water is now participating in the reaction in the other ionic liquids. So overall, this shows that the structure of the ionic liquid is very important when designing sensors to be used in different humidity environments. The second part of my talk will be focused on making more robust sensors. And so we've just talked about using liquids so far. And one of the issues is with a liquid that we can have spillage of the liquid over the planar electrode. So my postdoc journey combined a typical ionic liquid, a C2-MIM NTF2, with polymethyl methacrylate, and this has been shown in the literature to form very nice homogeneous films. And you can see a picture of the PMMA ionic liquid structure on the electrode. We used acetone to mix and transfer the gel polymer, and we had about a 50% mass ratio that gave a gel that didn't flow. And so just to show the proof of principle that the gel polymer electrode is very robust, we looked at the oxygen reduction response when we changed the orientation of the electrode. So with a neat ionic liquid, when we just have a droplet on the surface, you can see the black line shows the ideal 1 electron reduction when the electrode is upright. But then as we change the electrode to different orientations, we change the response quite significantly, and then eventually we lose all of our sensor signal when the electrolyte has flowed off. Whereas on the right hand side, the ionic liquid polymer gel, so the gel polymer electrolyte, we see identical oxygen reduction responses at all orientations. So this was all really good, but we found that when we tried to go to thinner layers in order to improve the response time, the film became very resistive. And additionally, it also didn't give any signal towards ammonia detection. So we were looking at other polymers, and in a conversation with Doug McFarlane, we started a collaboration to use a PVDF-HFP polymer mixed with ionic liquids as a gas sensor material. So we used a roughly 1/3 polymer and 2/3 ionic liquid mixture. And here you can see the SEM images of the polymer on the surface. And if you look closely, you can kind of see some porosity of these gels. And what it appears is happening is that the polymer is acting more as a scaffold, and the ionic liquid is flowing more freely through the scaffold. And this was actually quite interesting because it allowed us to go to very thin films of about 6 to 10 microns and still get very good conductivity. And because we could go to these thin films, we can then do long-term sensing of gases because otherwise the response time would have been far too long for the thicker films. And for both oxygen and ammonia, we're able to get very clear signals in the voltammetry. And so Ginny carried out the oxygen experiments, and my former PhD student Ghulam carried out the ammonia experiments. And so what this is a long-term chronoamperometric transient where we bias the potential where the gas oxidizes or reduces, and then we introduce the gas at different concentrations with a nitrogen flushing step in between just to observe the return to the baseline. So you can see really nice responses to both oxygen and ammonia, and we get linear calibration graphs which overlay quite well for the descending and the ascending phases. And the response times were very quick. So oxygen had a response time of about 10 seconds, and ammonia was about 40 seconds. And very importantly here was that we could easily detect less than 1 ppm of ammonia, which is very important for detecting this toxic gas in real environments. So although we have this gel polymer electrolyte, we can easily detect these low concentrations. Okay, so the final part of my talk will be moving slightly away from detecting gases, but talking about how we can detect explosives using ionic liquid gels. So a former PhD student, Holly, in collaboration with my postdoc, Ginny, we came up with a new method to detect TNT in water samples. So we've detected gases so far, but things like explosives are often present dissolved in water or in the solid form. So here we have a thin film electrode covered with a gel polymer. And the gel polymer, in this case, because we were dipping this directly into water, it had to be very hydrophobic. So we used a polyhexyl methacrylate polymer with a P14666 ionic liquid. And this gel polymer at a 1-to-1 mixture was drop cast onto the electrode. And then we had a water sample containing TNT. The electrode goes into that sample. We stir the solution, and then the TNT pre-concentrates into the ionic liquid gel polymer. And it's been shown by other groups that ionic liquids have a very unique ability to pre-concentrate explosives like TNT. So there's a very high solubility. And so because of this, we now can then have TNT in the gel polymer phase, and then we can apply a potential and observe a current response to detect the presence of TNT. And we use a cumulative calibration method because once the TNT goes into the ionic liquid, it does not want to come out again. So in this case, we added 1,1,222 micrograms per mil in the aqueous phase, and then we continually added the TNT into the gel. And you can see this calibration graph with the error bars for 3 repeat measurements. So very reproducible. And then just to confirm the method, we looked at the highest concentration just by itself with no cumulative methods. And then you can see it overlays the 10 microgram per mil response very well. So this was a new way to be able to detect TNT or other explosives in water samples using liquid-liquid partitioning. And more recently, my PhD student Kathy has been looking at trying to detect solid explosive samples. So she tried a number of different methods, but one of them that was very user-friendly and worked very well was simply using our gel polymer electrolyte, drop cast onto the thin film electrode, drying off the carrier solvent, and then simply just turning that electrode device upside down, pressing it several times into the solid sample of TNT. And this sample was on aluminium foil to collect the explosive. And then we turn the electrode back over again. We leave it for 30-minute development time. And the TNT then diffuses through the gel polymer to the electrode, and then we can see a signal. And because we wanted to use this for forensic applications in the real world, Kathy did this in ambient conditions, so under no gas flow. We didn't try to remove any moisture. So you can see the experimental setup where we have the aluminium foil and the electrode, and then we have a handheld portable potentiostat. And at the bottom, we have the same handheld device taken outside. This was actually done on a 36 Celsius day, so it was quite a hot day at the time. And what you can see here is the square wave voltammetry responses. So under ideal conditions, in figure A, you can see a nice sharp peak. And then as we go to our ambient conditions, because we've got more moisture and background contaminants, we still see a peak, but it's more broad. And when we do a background subtraction, you can see the red line then shows the response for TNT. And this method is very simple and user-friendly, and you can measure TNT within 30 minutes or less, and it's a good way to be able to identify if TNT is present, and then you can be able to detect this in real environments. So to conclude, I hope I've shown you that the choice of ionic liquid is very important, particularly when looking at developing sensors in different humidity environments. We can use ionic liquid polymer mixtures to overcome the leakage problem of membrane-free gas sensors, and certain polymers such as the PVDF-HFP gave very good responses at thin films to oxygen and ammonia. We also developed a new method to detect and quantify TNT in aqueous solutions and detected solid samples of TNT using our gel polymer electrolyte and thin film electrode. And so overall, I believe that ionic liquids have lots to offer as electrochemical solvents. There is still more fundamental work that's needed, so we can modify the ionic liquid structure even more and the polymer structure, and we can change the electrode surfaces. And the idea is then we could create these intentionally altered designer materials that can be used in the next generation of amperometric gas sensors. So to thank all of the people that have done this work, so my postdoc and my former and current PhD students shown in the pictures, everyone else in my group, and also the collaborators on the work I've talked about today, Doug and Simon for the explosives work, and then also to thank my institute and the ARC for funding. And finally, I hope you can all see this. Probably the most important person to thank would be my husband, because without him, I don't think it would be possible to have a family and an academic career. So thank you all for listening in, and I'm happy to take questions.
Fantastic, thank you, Debbie. So we have, I'll read out, there's one question in the chat and then I'll open it up to everyone else. So there's a question here about what the shelf life of the ionic liquid electrodes would be and what condition they need to be kept in.
Well, so ionic liquids, if we have, we've had ionic liquids in our cupboard for 11 years now, and they still work the same as they did 11 years ago. So I think ionic liquids are fine. The electrodes themselves, we've found that if, for example, the electrode becomes passivated or has oxides on them, we can clean them electrochemically and then just re-drop cast the ionic liquid onto the electrode. So that's one way that we can improve the shelf life of them. Once we actually have an electrode set up, we're still doing some work on this, but we can use it for maybe 10 or 12 long day experiments before it starts to go to show unusual signals, and then we would remove the ionic liquid gel, the gel polymer layer off, and then just reactivate the electrode. So there might be, there are some limitations. Obviously, we're using very thin films of the platinum on the electrode, but we see that they're very nice and reproducible, reusable.
I think you've answered that second question. People are welcome to turn their mics on and ask the questions in person if anybody. Do you want to ask that in person, or shall I read it out? So there was a question about, in an earlier slide you mentioned ammonia is quickly converted to nitrogen and hydrogen. Can you explain that again? Do you know what that was in relation to?
So ammonia, we need to understand the mechanisms that happen at the electrode, and ammonia has been shown not just in ionic liquids but in acetonitrile as well, to have the mechanism where the ammonia molecule breaks up and produces nitrogen and protons. So we ourselves haven't proven that, but there is a paper, if you're interested, I could forward it on to you. There is a paper where they showed in acetonitrile that that's the mechanism that occurs.
Thanks. Yes, I would appreciate it if you could send it to me, Debbie. I'll email you. I'll send you my email address.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, no worries.
Okay. There was another question about how long will it take to develop a functional sensor, for instance, methane detection?
For methane detection, was that?
That's one example, but in general, I suppose the question is how long will it take to develop perhaps in something commercially viable?
Well, methane is a tricky one. That's a very difficult one to get right. But I've been in talks with some gas sensor manufacturers, and in order to move an ionic liquid based sensor into the real world, it's at least 5 to 10 years. So we're still understanding the fundamentals, and in order to produce a commercially available device, especially based on something like our planar electrode devices, then it's quite a few years off in the future.
Okay. I had how do you control the selectivity of the sensor for a certain gas? That's one of the critical questions, isn't it?
Yeah. So because we're using an amperometric sensor, we can bias the potential at different potentials. So if you have gases that reduce at different potentials, then you can get some kind of selectivity there. It's obviously hardest to get selectivity if you have a gas that reduces at a very negative potential, because you're going to have everything else that reduces before that will interfere. There are some gases together that behave in a very similar way. So unfortunately, it is very difficult to completely remove the effect of one of them. So a lot of gas sensor manufacturers, they release a document that says if you have, you know, these two gases present, then they could give false responses to the other one. So it's something that can be worked on, but it's very difficult to do for gases that are very chemically similar.
Presumably the solubility of those different gases in the ionic liquid is crucial as well.
Yes, so solubility is important, but again, if they're chemically similar, then their solubilities will probably be the same as well.
Yeah. So she's asking, have you considered placing a selective membrane to get rid of possible interferences?
Yeah, so that's something which I've been thinking about. The issue with adding an extra membrane is then you've got that slow step of the gas going through the membrane as well. That is something that, for example, is done commercially. But again, it depends on the gas that you're looking for as to what gases will go through that membrane in a mixed environment. So we haven't actually done it ourselves, but yeah, it's something which could be done.
Okay. I think you've touched on this, but perhaps I'll ask the question again. Can the sensors be regenerated? What is the life for such sensors?
Yeah, so as I said, our planar electrode devices, once we start to see the current response go off, and particularly for some gases like sulfur dioxide, we see that we build up sulfur on the electrode, and that can start to block the electrode surface. So in those cases, as I said before, we can rinse off the ionic liquid solvent, and then we can regenerate the electrodes. We do that electrochemically, and most of the time we can get it back. Occasionally, if the electrode's been used for a long time, then obviously we have to throw them away. The advantage of what we're doing is the electrodes are very cheap, so they can essentially be disposable devices if you want them to be.
I had a question. Chair's privilege. So you mentioned with the films that you've been making that when they got to a particular thinness, that the resistance, they got too resistive. That seems counterintuitive. Do you know what's happening there?
So that was for the PMMA ionic liquid mixtures. And PMMA is known to mix very well with the ionic liquid. So it forms a nice homogeneous layer or film. And what we found was, as we go to really thin layers, essentially we have no movement of the ionic liquid. And that's why at the thin layer of the PMMA mixture, we just don't have very good conductivity between the electrodes. So we get a resistive looking voltammogram. Whereas for the PVDF-HFP mixtures, we didn't really have that because the ionic liquid seems to be more free to move.
Right. Okay. Do we have any more questions? Anybody wants to ask them out loud or type in the chat? We've got a couple more minutes. No, I don't think so. Well, they probably have your email address and your contact details if they have burning questions that they can get in touch with you.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, thanks very much then. I think it's time to draw this to a close. Really appreciate the excellent, very interesting talk. Debbie, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the nice invitation.
Thanks everyone for, yeah. All right. Thanks very much everyone for dialing in. Thank you. I'll get Lauren to perhaps close the meeting if you can.
I will switch it off for everyone.
Yeah. Somebody was asking for some reading material. I don't know if you want to get back to them on that, but
what sort of reading material?
Interesting topic. Could you suggest some readings? if you want that person's email address, it's probably
yeah. Just send it through, and I'll send on a review paper or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure who that is, but that would be good. Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks very much, Debbie. That was really good. Really cool.
Thank you. Sorry, I did go over time.
No, it's fine. It's perfect. It fits within an hour. That's all good. So.
Yeah. Excellent.
Great.
Well, thanks again, Jenny.
All right. Get back to you. Thank you.